So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first seminar series, first in the 2025 research seminar series for the Living with Disability Research Centre at La Trobe University. I should start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This is a very special seminar this afternoon because not only has it got some really leading speakers around issues of communication, it's also a celebration of the career of Professor Teresa Iacono, who will be known to many of you as an amazing contributor to academic and practical practice knowledge around people with intellectual disabilities and communication. So Teresa, as many of you know, has had 35 career years in this field and is about to retire from her last position at La Trobe University with the Living with Disability Research Centre. And we've been privileged to have her as part of the centre since it was founded in 2014. But I know there's many people here today who are speakers and who are in the audience who have known Teresa and her work for a much longer period. So hopefully we will be able to collect a lot of knowledge this afternoon about communication and people with intellectual disabilities and about the contribution that Teresa's made. Those of you who don't normally come to our seminars, the Q&A is open. You can put comments and questions in the Q&A, and I'll moderate the Q&A and make decisions about whether we'll ask those questions or read out those comments or what we'll do with them. But please put your comments in the Q&A and we'll try and address them. So the first, and we're recording this, so if you have to leave or you have colleagues who might be interested, it will be up on our website by early next week. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, who is Emeritus Professor Pat Mirenda from the University of British Columbia. Shall we take the slide down, James? Who is a leading authority on augmentative and alternative communication for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And Pat was Teresa's PhD supervisor. And so I think it's Pat who takes the credit for a lot of Teresa's capacity, particularly in terms of editing. It's something I think that's been passed down, and Teresa's passed down to other people, that attention to detail and quality of writing. But I'm sure Pat was responsible for a lot of other things as well. So I'm going to hand over to Pat, who's going to speak for about 20 minutes. So over to you. Just unmute yourself before you start. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. I'm just going to share my screen here and get started. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, a pleasure in very many ways, and I'm very honored to have been asked to contribute to this seminar. I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people in what is now called British Columbia, Canada, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And you can see the Coast Salish territory in the red circle on this map. I offer my respect to elders, both past and present, and I offer my gratitude to be allowed to support children, youth, and families who live on this land. I have two goals for today. I want to provide a very brief and selective overview of some of the key milestones in the field of augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, over the past 4-ish decades. And I want to highlight Teresa's contributions to the evolution of AAC during that time period. So, 4 decades ago, I was in my first faculty position at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I started there in 1984, and I was privileged in 1985 to be joined by David Buchelman, who was known for his entire career, pretty much, as the king of augmentative communication, at least in North America. So that was 1984. In 1987, Teresa arrived to begin her PhD program with emphasis on AAC. I like to think she came to Nebraska all the way from Australia to work with me, but in fact, I believe the truth is she came all the way to Nebraska to work with Dave. Nonetheless, I was the beneficiary of that decision. Let me back up just a bit for those of you who aren't familiar with AAC. AAC involves attempts to compensate for temporary or permanent impairments and participation restrictions of individuals with severe disorders of speech language production and or comprehension, including spoken and written modes of communication. So AAC modalities are numerous. They include manual sign or keyword sign, the use of objects or tactile symbols by people with visual impairments that represent messages, pictorial communication symbols that can be assembled on some kind of book or board, pictorial communication symbols that can be produced on an iPad or another kind of speech generating communication device, and textual communication systems for individuals who are literate. So AAC is very broad and covers a wide territory of options. So in 1987, when Teresa arrived, there were a few things happening in the field of AAC. First of all, candidacy models abounded and limited access to AAC. Candidates were made up. Can you still hear me? Okay. Were made up.
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. That basically determined who was eligible and who was not eligible for AAC. So, for example, one of the rules in one of the candidacy models was that if you weren't at Piaget's sensory motor stage 4, you weren't eligible for AAC. Other models said, well, if you didn't have a mental age of 2 or an IQ of X or Y, you weren't eligible for AAC. You weren't ready for AAC. And of course, what that meant is that many people with significant intellectual disabilities never had access to AAC because they didn't meet the criteria. Also in 1987, manual signing was the primary AAC modality that was taught to people with intellectual disabilities. There were really only a few types of aided AAC in the form of picture symbols that were available to them at that point. And one of them, of course, some of you will be familiar with, and that is the Compix system that was developed in Australia. The AAC journal was only 3 years old. There were no AAC texts. And because of that, AAC was rarely taught at the university level in 1987. There were some speech output communication devices available, but speech output sounded like this.
Greetings, Professor Iacono. Would you like to play a game? How about a nice game of chess?
If you understood that, you're a better person than I am. So let me give you the translation and play it again.
Greetings, Professor Iacono. Would you like to play a game? How about a nice game of chess?
So that was pretty much the best we could do in 1987. And as you can see, that wasn't particularly adequate. Similarly, prior to 1990, little information was available about how to teach individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities to communicate using AAC modalities in natural settings. Almost all of the research up until that point in time had been done in very highly structured artificial settings rather than natural settings like playgrounds and snack time and book reading and so forth and so on. So one of the first things that Teresa and I collaborated on was this article published in what was then called Focus on Autistic Behavior to pull together the literature on instructional techniques for promoting AAC in natural context with those students. Individuals with significant multiple disabilities, cognitive, motor, and sensory impairments were virtually always considered not ready for AAC prior to 1990. So Teresa and some colleagues at the University of Nebraska in Omaha published the first article documenting the use of tactile AAC by a deafblind child with severe motor impairment and profound intellectual disability. This case study was really important because it really was the first of its kind to deal with an individual with such significant disabilities. Prior to 1990, people who relied on AAC were almost never included as authors in the academic literature. The academic literature was the purview of those of us who were researchers. And so Teresa and I were very privileged to have Bob Williams join us as the third author on this invited paper in the Journal of the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps. I don't know if most of you know Bob, but he co-founded Communication First in 2019. Bob is a man with cerebral palsy who uses AAC, and he did so after retiring from a distinguished 4-decade career in the US federal and state government, most recently as director of the US Independent Living Administration of the Department of Health and Human Services. And we were very pleased to have Bob join us as a co-author in this paper. And one of the points that we made in this paper read as follows: we must believe that all people, no matter how severe their level of disability, can and frequently do attempt to communicate with others throughout their lives. Without this belief, we will continue to disregard communicative behaviors even when they're obvious, and will be prevented from persistently looking for them when they are not. This was an important paper for its time because I think we took a very firm stance about the ridiculousness of the candidacy models, among other things. Still, around 1990, aided AAC using picture symbols was not particularly common. I said this already. Most individuals with intellectual disabilities were taught to use manual signs. However, their manual sign usage often was limited to single words. It didn't really become a language system for most people with intellectual disabilities. And some researchers, most people were concerned about that, and some researchers suggested that multimodal communication interventions that combined manual signs and picture symbols on a voice output device might be more effective, but there had been no research done to investigate this hypothesis. So, for her doctoral dissertation, Teresa tackled that topic, and that study was later published in the AAC Journal, a comparison of uni and multimodal AAC techniques. So that was another important paper that paved the way for some of the things that I'll talk about later on. Between 1990 and 2000, things really started picking up in the AAC field. Candidacy models became increasingly obsolete, thank goodness. Many aided AAC symbol sets became available, and manual signing was really no longer considered the default. And a wide variety of AAC devices became available now with much more intelligible speech output. And I think you'll hear that quite clearly in this brief clip of Stephen Hawking.
The first speech synthesizer I had was almost unintelligible, but then I got a speech synthesizer, which was designed for a telephone directory service. That voice was very clear, although slightly robotic. I am told that children who need a computer voice want one like mine.
So I'm sure you recognize that voice. Voice output has become even better since then, but you don't need a translation. And this is really just 10 years after the one that I showed you before. There was also increased attention to the need to individualize AAC options. And a paper that supported that was this one by Teresa on individual language learning styles in AAC, which came out around the same time as a replication study of her doctoral dissertation, where she again compared sign alone and combination with an electronic communication device in this case study with one of her master's students. The other thing that's happened in this decade was the publication of AAC texts. This was the first edition of the AAC text, co-authored by Dave Buchelman and myself in 1992. And the field at that point was growing so rapidly that a mere 6 years later, we published the second edition in 1998. A lot of work was going on during this time period, also on identification of the key vocabulary that needed to be included in AAC systems. And Teresa and Sue Ballenden, her doctoral student, published a series of articles focused on vocabulary during meal breaks, particularly in the Australian context. So that was another important contribution. In the decade between 2000 and 2010, a bunch of things continued to happen. Teresa and Sue presented the work on vocabulary at the ISAC conference, the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication in Washington, D.C. in 2000. I'm sure that many of you will recognize some of the people, including Teresa and Jackie Brown, who she worked with later on in the AAC Journal, and Jeff Sigafus, who for some reason is looking very unhappy here. I'm not sure what that's all about. The other thing that's important about 2000 is that Sue Ballenden, who was Teresa's doctoral student, became ISAC president. So here you see Teresa's influence on leadership, the development of leadership in the field of AAC, not just research, but leadership as well. I was editor of the AAC Journal from 1998 to 2000, and Teresa served ably as associate editor during that time. And when it was time for me to step back, I convinced her to take on the role of editor after me. And she did so from 2002 to the end of 2004, working with Jackie Brown, whose photo I just showed you. Jackie says, "Hi, Teresa." And thus became the first non-North American editor of the journal, another important milestone. In 2005, the third edition of the AAC text was published, and there was so much. I mean, we had a terrible time with this edition of the book because the AAC field was moving so fast, we had to be quite selective about what to put in and then what to leave out. And one of the things that we left out, because there just wasn't room for it, was a focus on AAC and autism spectrum disorder. The field had really expanded in this area, and the publishers of the text came to Dave and I and said, well, now we need a book on AAC and autism. And Dave said, well, I don't know anything about that, and looked at me, and I turned around and asked Teresa, and the first edited text on AAC and autism was published in 2009. This decade also saw the advent of a number of reliable AAC assessment tools, including the CCC checklist of communication competencies that I know many of you will be familiar with, that focused on adolescents and adults with severe disabilities. It was published in 1999, but Teresa and her colleagues examined the psychometric properties of the instrument and made revisions to increase its reliability. And then it was republished in 2009. Of course, the decade of 2000 to 2010 also was the decade of the AAC revolution, thanks to the advent of the iPad and all of the AAC apps that could now be loaded onto the iPad, which reduced the price of a voice output communication device quite remarkably and made AAC much more accessible to people who previously either couldn't afford it or couldn't carry the larger AAC devices around. In the 15 years that followed, there were continued developments. In 2013, the fourth edition of the AAC book was published. This was the last one that I was involved in. And 2020, Janice Light took my place as the co-author with Dave in the 5th edition of the text. And here we are in 2025, and I think there will probably be another volume coming out in the next couple of years. During this 15-year period, the motto, not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say, really became deeply ingrained in AAC culture. AAC users started to participate in research, indeed lead research studies in many cases. The combination of the iPad plus some kind of AAC app is undoubtedly now the most commonly used option for people with intellectual disabilities. And there have been a number of important advances in that technology, including the use of visual scene displays and just-in-time programming. I don't have time to go into those now, but if you Google them, you'll find them. Very important moving forward apps. Multimodal aided language modeling is now one of the most commonly used AAC instructional techniques. And remember, the first study looking at multimodal AAC was Teresa's doctoral dissertation. And of course, brain-computer interfaces are receiving increased attention in the field. And it'll be very interesting over the next decade to see where that goes. During this 15-year period, Teresa herself branched out considerably. Of course, she continued to publish in the area of AAC, also did a number of important articles related to inclusive education, focused very much on service enhancement in hospitals and group homes, published a number of studies looking at autism early intervention screening and identification and early intervention, and has also been active in advocating for active supports and well-being for people with severe intellectual disabilities and communication needs. So that was a little quick run through. Teresa, as you begin your retirement, I'm happy to know that a new generation of AAC researchers and clinicians will take over the work to which you have devoted your career. So I want to thank you for your service and contributions. I want to thank you for preparing the next generation, which basically means you can retire guilt-free. And I want to thank you for being both a researcher and a passionate advocate for people with intellectual disabilities and complex communication needs. We've come a long way since you arrived in Nebraska in 1987, but we still have far to go. And again, I go back to the 1990 article that we wrote with Bob Williams to remind all of us that we must understand that the greatest handicaps still faced by persons with severe disabilities are the negative attitudes and limiting assumptions of others. Much work remains to be done to tear down the attitudinal, public policy, and other barriers that prevent communication opportunity. Teresa, again, thank you for all of your contributions, and thank you, Christine, for inviting me to contribute to this important seminar. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Pat. That's an amazing overview of the development of AAC and of Teresa's role in that, which I think many of us have not really been aware of that very early work and how important that was. So thank you. So over to you, Hilary.
Oh, that was fantastic, Pat. Thanks so much. I'm just going to try and touch on just a small bit of what Teresa's enabled us to do. But first, I'd really like to acknowledge that I'm talking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded. It's good to remember that people have been communicating on this land in many and different formats throughout time. So today, I'd like to tell you a story about the evolvement of an approach to working with adults with intellectual disability who have little or no speech. This approach was influenced by a quote I saw on a wall at the Sandwell Communication Aid Centre, Birmingham, UK. This place does no longer exist, but it did in the 80s. It's been the focus of my work and that of the fantastic colleagues I've had the pleasure to work with. Bear with me a bit as I backtrack to the days before Teresa, or BT. Our story started in the 1980s, after Karen Bloomberg and myself completed a Victorian population survey of people with little or no speech. And in those days, it was termed as having a severe communication impairment. The then Schools Commission funded Karen and I to provide speech pathology support to all the special developmental schools in the state of Victoria, that is. This was the start of our service, SCIOP, the Severe Communication Impairment Outreach Project, providing a tertiary model of support. The model commenced with a day's training into augmentative communication to the whole of the school's staff. 3 additional days of consultancy were provided to the school each year. On the consultancy day, we worked directly with children and significant others, whoever that might be, parents, aides, teachers, preschool, to develop a program of support for the child. Each time we came back, we worked with the significant others to monitor the progress. We looked at ways to skill others to be able to observe how children were communicating and how to expand or develop those skills. We used an observational tool that was completed by the person who knew the child well. This worked towards establishing the communication stage of the child, thus suggesting an appropriate intervention. And when we think about what Pat said about the candidacy models, this was in some ways a way of overlooking the candidacy model. Everybody could do something. This was called the pre-verbal communication schedule, or the PVCS. The checklist looked at early communicative behaviours using body language and facial expression and gestures, informal communication where objects, sounds and pointing might be used intentionally, and formal symbolic skills, the use of pictures, signs, speech. We realised how important it was to provide a framework for observations that can be used by others and not rely solely on a speech pathologist's expertise. After several years, sort of early 1990s, SCOPE, which was then the Spastic Society of Victoria, provided some base funding for SCIOP to provide a similar service for adults on a fee-for-service basis. We were faced with many challenges. One of these was the lack of any valid or reliable assessment tools for adults with significant intellectual disabilities, and a workforce with little or no knowledge about communication. We needed to pull on the adult communication research for possible solutions, and there wasn't much. We attended a conference every 2 years, ISAC, the International Society for Alternative and Augmentative Communication. I am so grateful for those conferences. I'm so grateful for meeting so many colleagues, such as Pat there. We searched for knowledge and met a lot of wonderful people, Pat being one of them. We came across some Swedes, Mats Granlund and Cecilia Olsson. And in that picture, we've got Mats and Karen and Eva, who was Mats' partner, and Cecilia. They were doing innovative evidence-based work with adults using a cognitive developmental model. They too were focusing on the person within an environment and how to make the environment communication rich. Mats had developed a training program and materials. Tina Caithness, who is in the bottom photo between Karen and myself, was working with us, and she went and spent some time in Sweden bringing back their resources to adapt to an Australian context. Unfortunately, this was not straightforward. First of all of the resources were in Swedish, not impossible to fix, but the resources were focused on adults with intentional communication skills. For us, there was a gap. We wanted to provide support that fitted adults with profound intellectual disabilities for whom symbolic representation was not the only option. Tina took maternity leave, and Denise West ably stepped in and started looking at what needs to change in the environment to make communication happen. This was a huge piece of work. Aided and abetted by Karen Bloomberg, a package of materials and a training model was developed. The project was based on Granlund and Olson's 1993 research that changes in the client's communication relied heavily on the frequency and appropriateness of the staff's interactions. The staff training and regular supervision was essential to long-term success. The Picture It package was born, acronym of Partners in Communication Training Using Real Environments. And I have a feeling the IT was interactive training, but I really can't remember. Teresa provided the research methodology and her inquiring mind. The 8-month-long project looked at what staff supporting adults in day and residential services within the Spastic Society of Victoria might need to provide appropriate communication supports for adults with severe and multiple disabilities who had little or no speech. In the project, there were 8 individuals with a disability paired with 2 staff, one from the home and one from the day service environment. The results caused us to reflect on the hierarchical structure of organisations, implicit, not explicit understandings, and the powerful role of disability support workers in enhancing lives of the people they support. The downside of the project was that it was long and time-consuming, therefore costly, but providing staff who worked in group homes an opportunity to meet and collaborate with staff in day services and develop partnerships. This partnership was so valuable. It increased awareness about what happened in both environments and developed a fuller picture of an individual's skills. It helped them to understand that the individual's behaviours are influenced by interactions with them and around them. Staff increased their knowledge about and engagement with communicative behaviours. Staff also developed skills in planning communication objectives, a skill that was lacking at the start of the project. One of the unexpected outcomes of the project was that 50% of the staff in the project left the organisation a year after completing the course. You might have many thoughts about why that might have happened, but it seemed to us that several of the staff had gained more senior positions in other organisations based on their learning through the Picture It project. From this piece of work, Teresa became pivotal to the development of many of our future projects. SCIOP had become the Communication Resource Centre with government funding assured for 4 years. We did last quite considerably longer than that. The aim of the CRC, later to become CIRC, Communication and Inclusion Resource Centre, which is still going strong, was to build the capacity of the community to support and include people with little or no speech. Teresa enabled a rigour to our projects and a published trail of our work. And I'm sure many of the people who are joining us online, and I just got a note from Katie, so I know she's there, are here in the photo when we all looked so much younger. And Teresa was still wearing glasses. So a hi to all of those people. From this, one of the outcomes of the project was the need for an appropriate adult assessment of communication skills for people with severe intellectual disabilities. And the first version of the CCC was developed, as Pat has mentioned. It was also designed for support workers to complete based on their observations of an individual. Teresa assisted us in establishing reliability and validity of that tool. Changes were made to it during this process, such as adding an observed or not observed column. When we interviewed the staff about how they completed that survey and what they saw and what they didn't see, we'd find that staff would say, oh yeah, they can do that. But when we questioned them closely, they were unable to describe an action or activity where this skill was demonstrated. Probably we'd all be rich if the people we talked to said, He understands everything I say. We know that is not often true, not always true. We have to be aware that assuming competence can be as dangerous as assuming incompetence. The assessment links with a package of materials so that support workers know what to do to support communication. Okay, come on. We employed Teresa for 2 days a week, but she felt this was too generous and continued to give us very similar support in 1 day a week. The CRC team, particularly myself, Karen Bloomberg, Denise West, Katie Lyon, Tina Caithness, and Marnie Cameron, all utilised her research skills to develop and expand the evidence base for working with people with little or no speech. She supported us across broad work areas, including speech pathology student learning, electronic and non-electronic communication, working with children and adults, and of course, facilitated communication. We once gave her an award for having no ego. Such was her commitment to collegiality, her openness, willingness to support naive researchers, her ability to start and finish a project, including a journal publication, made her such a pleasure to work with. She knew how to write, a skill she drilled into me as a PhD student of hers, and I suggest probably Sue Ballenden, who I'm pleased to see is on the screen, would also say, and I will never forget that. She knew what questions to ask, and her initial input into developing CERC's work around communication access focused on all stakeholders with an emphasis on listening to people with a communication disability, their needs and aspirations. Communication access is a prime example of building the capacity of the community, and thousands of transport workers, ambulance and emergency workers, police, shop owners have now experienced successful interactions with people who have little or no speech. Much of our work would not have had its longevity without her input. Our work was achieved through a team of passionate therapists, aides, community engagement workers, and people with communication disabilities. We're also grateful for what we learned from all the support workers. I worked in a privileged era where there was block funding, and funding bodies understood that a communication disability does not just belong to an individual, and capacity building is essential for an inclusive community. The individualised approach to the NDIS does not support capacity building in the same way. However, the CCC remains as a foundation stone from which new tools may emerge to suit current and future understandings about communication and cognition, and we look forward to that. Many thanks, Teresa, for sharing your expertise and also for sharing your love of red wine. Thank you.
Do you want? Okay, thank you very much, Hilary. That was great. There's some fantastic pictures. So thanks everybody for your comments, and we might move over now to Sue Ballenden, who is in Norway, and it's very early in the morning. And Sue was, I think, maybe Teresa's first PhD student, but certainly up there amongst them, and is an emeritus professor now, and lives and does some work in Norway, but travels to Australia quite frequently. And she's going to talk about, is core and fringe vocabulary still a relevant topic for people who use AAC? So over to you, Sue.
Okay, thanks very much. My apologies for being late. I miscalculated the time. I'm always very critical of people that do that. And anyway, there we are. So I'm sorry, and I'm very grateful to be here. I thought I'd start off with just a little tribute to Teresa. I was indeed her first supervisor. It was, I think, serendipity in that I was at Macquarie thinking that perhaps I ought to do something other than just have a diploma, which in the very ancient times when I did speech therapy, as it was called then, was all that you could get. And along came Teresa, fresh from the States, and I was quite liking being at university. So I asked her if she'd like, if I could do a PhD with her. And it's also great that Pat's here, because the first topic I chose, I marched off to my first ISAC conference and told Pat what my topic was. And she said, "Oh my God, who would be interested in that?" And then told me that a PhD is like an onion, something that you should be able to peel back for the rest of your research life. So I had a somewhat boozy session very late at night in the bar with Norman Alm, and came up with a topic which I then talked to Teresa about, and she, I think now when I look back, very selflessly said yes, that she would help me with it and she would supervise. And I think it was selfless because her interest was not in adults and not particularly certainly not in core vocabulary, but when she'd been a student, one of her colleagues was Sheila Stewart, who had been interested in adults and had been interested in vocabulary. So that was of great benefit to me because of course Teresa knew all that. And anyway, she put aside her interests in children and literacy, which I think was, at the time beginning to develop, and took me on as a student. She was a fantastic supervisor, and during my, I suppose now quite a long time of being an academic and having students, I've really held her as my model and tried to emulate her supervision practice. She was, as I said, selfless. She was very quick to respond. I think if I'd have sent something in and it had been more than 3 days before it came back, I would have been on the edge of my chair thinking all was lost. She was very thorough, and anyone who's been supervised by her will know that. She instilled in me, and I'm very grateful for it, the belief that you might as well get it right the first time rather than positively go on only to find at the end you've got so much to redo. She was a great editor. I think, I believe Teresa taught me to write, and I hope that I've managed, and I think I have, with many of my PhD students, managed to instill that just through the things that she taught me. She was endlessly positive. I can remember ringing her up in tears because I'd been to see someone who was doing a linguistic study of meal break conversations, and I was looking at meal break conversations, and this woman was looking at conversations over dinner. And I said I forget at that stage how much data, but hundreds of thousands of words. And this woman had 4 pages. And she said that I couldn't possibly analyze what I was doing, that it was absolutely ridiculous, and I should probably give it up. And that's the only time I think I cried. I rang Teresa in tears saying, "Oh," and she was just wonderful. She was positive, she was calming. She settled me up again and was positive right through. When things didn't go so well, she was always there with solutions. That really worked. And not only did I learn a lot from her, but I loved doing my PhD. It was, 3 of the best, or 3.5 of the best years of my life, really. It was great. And Teresa made that. At the time, I knew people who were finding their supervisors very difficult. I'm sure the supervisors were finding them difficult too. But it was a joy. It was a joy to be working with her, and I felt privileged to be able to do that. The other thing was a joy was when work came back and there was more black than red on it. And I can remember David Trembath saying to me exactly the same thing. Oh, I knew I was getting better because it came back and it looked more black than red. And it took me a long time before that happened, but it did. And I think that certainly, as I say, taught me all the editing and writing skills that I still am grateful that I have. So my study was a study of the vocabulary of mealtime conversations at work, in sort of, so what people talked about at breaks and lunch breaks and coffee breaks. And we use communication to of course we use communication. Vocabulary is the foundation to some extent of communication. It's what we use to talk about all the things we want to talk about. And for many people, particularly when I started my PhD, which I think was in 91, people using AAC were very much stuck with systems that focused on wants and needs and systems based on picture producers. And an understanding of core vocabulary and helped create new systems and new programs, and not only enhance communication who used AAC in what they could say, but also increase the speed. But of course, core vocabulary alone is not fast enough. So this is just a quick description, really, if there's anyone here that has never heard me speak about core vocabulary, core and fringe vocabulary, which seems kind of odd, because I feel that I've talked about it for so long. But 80% of what we say consists of about 250 to 300 words. And I think it's worth remembering that when we talk about some of the new AI projects like Chat GPT, because whenever I've talked about core vocabulary, there's nearly always been somebody in the audience who said, well, that may be true for most people, but it's not true for me. I use lots of different words. And one of the things that I'll talk about a bit later is this issue of authorship and ownership, and of the right to use your own words. We like to think that what we say is unique to us. And I think that's one of the difficulties, where some people have difficulty in accepting that, in fact, a lot of what we say is not unique to us at all. It's what everybody says, and it holds, and it's made up, as you know, core vocabulary is made up really of verbs, pronouns, prepositions, and adjectives. So it doesn't carry all that many nouns or specific meaning-making words. This is left to fringe vocabulary. So fringe vocabulary is used in fewer situations, in that it is very often context specific. It's not much use having the fringe vocabulary of the preschool if you're going to the doctor. So in 1995, when I finished my PhD, the Australia, it was a big core vocabulary, and it was at the time the only Australian core vocabulary that was based on conversations, informal conversations, rather than on court reporting or the vocabulary that came out of newspapers, which were also, there were big vocabulary corpuses at corpori at Macquarie, partly because of the dictionary, and they had a big linguistics department. So in 1995, the Australian vocabulary list was the only list that had fuck in the top 250 words. Teresa and I laughed about this a lot and thought about whether we should keep it in, because there was one participant who said things like, fuck me, my boss, he says fuck this and fuck that the whole time. It's always fuck off, fuck this, I hate the fucking cunt. Which, of course, to some extent biased the sample, but I collected that vocabulary, that sample every day over 3 weeks, and his language didn't change. And so we included it because for some people, if you're talking with your friends at work, this is the sort of language you use. These are the sort of words you want. And I can remember at the time there was someone whose mother said, oh, you know, he's grown up now and he wants to, you know, look at pictures of girls and he wants to talk like a boy. So I'm getting him a subscription to Vogue so that he, you know, doesn't get the wrong ideas of how to behave. And this seemed an antithesis really to what many of the average working people, certainly in my study, were talking about. So I got a lot of radio interviews out of it, but I've never seen it on anybody's board, but you know, maybe it's there. So the idea was that having a more relevant vocabulary would stop the sort of boards, or would ease the use of boards that came with words like, not all that long ago that I saw a hospital board with comb, TV, book, toilet, please. And the use of core vocabulary meant that we could use, there was proof, I suppose, that words like I want, that, no, ask me who might be more useful. And core vocabulary is stable across time, place, and country, which worked really well because many systems across the world were many AAC systems were starting to be changed to incorporate and focus more on core vocabulary as well as fringe. And I think particularly of, at the time in the mid-90s, Bruce Baker and the increasing development of MinSpeak, which had a strong focus on core vocabulary. And core vocabulary is being used successfully now, along, of course, with fringe, but with a focus on core in Germany, teaching German to children from for refugees and from asylum-seeking backgrounds. However, we have to wonder about now whether AI programs that are coming increasingly into focus, I suppose, such as DeepSeek and ChatGPT, will give whether these vocabularies are now relevant still, whether we need to still think about core and fringe vocabulary. And I think it's a pity that Teresa's retiring now, when this would be, you know, perfect. It would be great to do some work looking at this. I'm sure one also always retires with some regrets, whether you have a regret about core vocabulary or not, I don't know. So there's quite a lot in AAC on AI and AAC, but there's very little on the use of actual AI programs such as DeepSeek, which is very new, of course, or ChatGPT. There's a very nice study done, a small study by Griffith and Co., which are people coming out of Dundee, which where they got 35 people together, including 2 AAC users, and looked at the pros and cons of using a AI-generated speech program. And the pros, of course, were speed. It could be very much quicker. Access, that it will move the field forward. There's been quite a few papers that talk about AAC being stuck in, you know, that the technology now is moving forward quicker than it's moving forward in AAC. There's the thought that it will enhance linguistic competence, and I wonder what Teresa would think about that, because if you're not actually creating it yourself, I'm not quite sure how that would happen. And enhances social media use, which was a study by it could enhance social media use, which was work from a review by Hemsley et al. The cons are bias, that it's not developed from in the natural languaging process. It's not taking into account people with disability, so it's likely to be ableist in the sorts of text that can generate. Samples of what's been done with it so far are small. There's a concern. There was a concern amongst these 35 people about ownership and authorship, and I thought that was very pertinent, given the concerns that people still have about core vocabulary, that it's not how they talk. I think we all think there are certain things we say and certain things we do, and that our speech and the language that we use is recognizable to others as being us. And I think that's to some extent true. You know, we all know people who say certain things and we think, oh yeah, that's exactly what they'd say. There's a lack of transparency, how these corpuses, or how these sort of databases are really gathered. And there's a huge issue about privacy, because the samples or the work, the outputs are kept, and it's not really very clear why they're kept or what they'll be used for, but they are kept. And I think we can take a warning from this, certainly in Australia, where in the UK, where right now politicians and ministers are losing their jobs because of WhatsApp leaks. They write things on WhatsApp and it's leaked, and it's not really what we expect our people in government to be saying about us, and they lose their jobs. So that privacy is a huge issue, which both social media and presumably programs like the ones we're talking about now have not really thought about. The other issue is training. So that they came up with, that training was who's going to be there to show people how to do it. And one of the agreements was amongst this group that safeguards and guidelines and a code of practice are needed, but quite what would go into them and who would do it was almost, I think, put in the too hard basket. So my conclusion really is that AI communication tools are under-researched in AAC, in that there's there are quite a lot of papers about potential uses and so on, but there are no studies really or very few, a couple with people on the spectrum, but very few on how to use them and how they're being used. There are perceived advantages, but very real concerns. And I wonder if one might, I would certainly probably argue that potentially they could be facilitators for facilitated communication, that they can take facilitated communication one step further. And I think that's a real concern. And I don't know if any of you ever use eBay. If you put something up for sale, I thought I'd sell some curtains on eBay. So I put up about 5 words: fabric, Merimeko, curtains, and I think the colour. And then I got a little message from eBay saying, would I like them to develop the sales pitch? I thought, oh yeah. It came up with an amazing sales pitch. I would never have thought of it. I could have sat all day. It's not the way I talk. So, and I thought, and I think that really made me think, oh, I should have a little look about this, because I think it potentially plays right into the hands of, it's something that could be very much misused by the people who are already misusing things using facilitated communication, in my view. And I wonder how the AAC community, and particularly people like Teresa and Bronwyn Hemsley, Ralph Schlosser, who've been very involved in managing or trying to manage and trying to pointing out why facilitated communication is so dangerous and not really communication at all, they will have new work cut out, I think. So I think core and fringe vocabulary continues to be important. It's readily available. There's strong research supporting it. It's important for language learning and literacy. And I think there's less now, we might say, there has less opportunity for damage. I hope that this, so early in the morning, this has been a coherent enough presentation for you to feel that I must have benefited from being supervised by Teresa to be able to do it at all. I certainly feel that. I'm, as I say, eternally grateful. I've thought of her, or I've thought of you, Teresa. I'm sure you must be there, though I can't see you. Not every day of my life, but very, very often, and very, very often when I supervised. So I'm very grateful to you. Through meeting you, you opened a new window in my life, which not only gave me a livelihood, but gave me a livelihood that I loved. And I think for anybody to be able to say, particularly now, in the time that we're in now, I had a job and I loved every minute of it, is an enormous privilege. And you gave that to me. I feel that you opened the doors for me. You took me to Isaac. You introduced me to all sorts of interesting people like Pat Mirenda, and you instilled in me the skills that made it possible for me to go on and have an academic career. And for when I think of all the people that have had influence on my life in terms of my working life, I have to say that is you. You did that for me. And yet another proof that you are selfless. You let me be the first person to cook meat in your new oven a very long time ago. So thank you very much. And I'll leave you with a little headline that I got from The Guardian last week, which says, Elon Musk put a chip in this paralyzed man's brain. Now he can think, now he can move things with his mind. Should we be amazed or terrified? And for the people that, and there are many, I think, that are hoping that this may happen with communication, I think it's something that is an issue that will become a major ethical issue within our field. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Susan. That was a really fascinating mixture of recognizing Teresa's contribution, but also your own contribution to core and fringe vocabulary and to thinking about AI and the future. That was great. Do you want to just click that exit so that we can see you again?
Oh, yeah.
And our next speaker is Stella Karitzis, who is another of Teresa's PhD students, a bit after Sue, who is now head of research at Scope. And you're going to talk, I'm not sure what you're going to talk about because you didn't give me a title, but you gave me an abstract. But over to you, Stella.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm talking about the CDDHV years. So we have heard up until now about some of Teresa's work in severe communication impairment or communication disability and AAC. She has, though, conducted a whole heap of work in health, mental health and behaviours of concern that I want to talk about today. I first met Teresa back in 2001 when I started working at Monash University. She was the research director at CDDHV, which I'm sure many of you will know is a centre that conducts educational, clinical and research activities to improve the health of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It wasn't until 2005 that I started working at CDDHV. Teresa was my manager and would later become my PhD supervisor. One of the very first projects that I worked on with Teresa was the Living Well research. This was a longitudinal study exploring the health experiences of Australians with developmental disability. We knew from previous work that people with developmental disability, including intellectual disability, had a lower life expectancy and poorer health outcomes than the general population. Unfortunately, this is still the case today. The Living Well research sought to build on this knowledge. The research involved more than 600 participants, so pretty big numbers even by today's standards, and we found that only a very small proportion of people with developmental disability took part in preventative health activities. Participation in cholesterol screening, blood sugar screening, blood pressure checks was really low, as was cancer screening. And cancer screening included prostate screening, pap smears, clinical breast exams, and mammograms. There was also low engagement in hearing and vision tests, and participation in all of these screening activities remained low 3 years later when we conducted the follow-up research. And as many of us will know, participation in a lot of these screening activities still remains low today. As part of this research, we also looked at secondary conditions. Secondary conditions are those that arise when a person experiences additional complications that have an impact and reduce their independence. This is in addition to their primary disability. Identifying secondary conditions is really important because they are generally preventable. Through the Living Well project, we found that participants had, on average, around 11 secondary conditions. These secondary conditions that caused people the greatest limitations included physical fitness and conditioning, weight, dental and oral hygiene, and communication difficulties. It's pretty obvious from this slide that these are all issues that can be readily addressed, but people with disabilities still experience them today. We also conducted research into behaviours of concern and mental health. For example, we conducted research about the relationship between chemical and physical restraint and individual and organisational factors. We piloted tools to help identify mental health conditions and explored the impact of behaviours of concern on the psychological wellbeing of disability support workers. Through this research, we found that out of all of the disability worker characteristics that we looked at, the use of restrictive practices was related to only disability worker attitudes. This quite clearly indicated and indicates today that the attitudes of people towards restraining people with a disability must be shifted. We also found that the use of restrictive practices was related to support needs, such that those with higher support needs were more likely to be restrained. We learned that the majority of the 191 disability workers who participated in our research had been exposed to behaviours of concern. Half of the disability workers had been exposed to behaviour that resulted in injury to them. More than half had been exposed to behaviour that resulted in injury to others. We also found that being exposed to behaviours of concern contributed to poor psychological wellbeing in disability workers. And the disability workers that we focused on were support workers and house supervisors. We learned through this research that disability staff did implement strategies to manage behaviours, but the strategies did not appear to be based on a functional assessment and were largely reactive. There was also very little evidence of teaching replacement behaviours or new skills as a strategy for managing behaviour. I'm sure many of you who work in this space can recognise that we still see a lot of these patterns today. As Hilary mentioned, Teresa also worked at Scope, so she was seconded to Scope 1 day a week. Mine and Teresa's time at Scope did not overlap, but as Hilary spoke about earlier, she did work on a number of projects, some of which are listed on this slide. but I won't really go into it much as I think Hilary has covered it well enough. What many of you may not know is that Teresa also made a mark on research ethics. In 2007, she was awarded the inaugural NHMRC Ethics and Integrity Award. This award was presented to her by the then Federal Minister, the Honourable Nicola Roxon, and it was in recognition of her long-standing commitment to research and ethics in relation to people with intellectual disability and complex communication needs. So a great achievement. This is perhaps a good segue into my reflections about what I have learned from Teresa and her impact on my career. Teresa taught me to see the ethics process as a good thing and not adversarial. She taught me that the national statement should be my North Star. It was with Teresa's encouragement that I joined my first ever ethics committee, and all these years later, I still sit on an ethics committee as a research member. This is without a doubt Teresa's influence. Teresa taught me about doing research in real-world settings. What looks good on paper doesn't necessarily translate well in practice. She taught me about the realities of doing research with a hard-to-reach group that has often been excluded from research altogether. As a PhD supervisor, I have to agree with everything that Sue said about Teresa. She was the perfect supervisor. She was incredibly selfless because, as with Sue, she did supervise my PhD, which was on a topic that wasn't necessarily her area. So my focus was on challenging behaviour, but she was still incredibly knowledgeable, as Sue mentioned, always available, dependable and organised. Teresa gave great feedback on the various drafts of a PhD, but feedback aside, you could always tell how Teresa was feeling about something she was reading by how far her pencil or her pacer, I think it was off memory, went into the paper and how many circles, how many times she actually circled something. Teresa helped me learn to be a better writer. She is, without a doubt, as others have spoken to today, the grammar queen. So thanks to Teresa, I know the difference between while, whilst and although. I know that using practically and virtually are big no-nos and should be avoided. What does practically zero mean, Stella? She would write. What do you mean by virtually non-existent? Does it exist or not? And of course, and I wonder if the other PhD students can relate to this, the dreaded anthropomorphism. Those got lots and lots of circles, and I'm not even sure what I wrote, but it was an anthropomorphism. Thanks to Teresa, though, I got through my PhD relatively unscathed, and it was a positive experience. I know how fortunate I am to be able to say that. So, Teresa, thank you for your invaluable contribution to disability. You leave behind an incredible legacy, not only through your research, but your influence on future generations of researchers. It has been a privilege to work with you and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. The final speaker before we hand over to Teresa is Kelly, who is a lecturer in speech pathology at La Trobe Rural Health School and is a current PhD student of Teresa's, but is also going to talk about something nobody else has mentioned or mentioned in passing, is Teresa's contribution to teaching in speech pathology and across the board at the Rural Health School. I mean, Teresa is a very well-equipped, very able teacher and gifted teacher, as well as a researcher. So over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, terrific. So yes, I currently work with Teresa for a few more days anyway, and I'm a lecturer in speech pathology, and as Chris said, a current PhD student, and can absolutely relate to all of the comments that have been made about Teresa as the perfect supervisor. It's been, yeah, an absolute pleasure my experience so far. So Chris asked me to speak today about Teresa's contribution to teaching, and I'll speak about her contribution to my personal learning, but also what I've observed of the impact of her work on our students, so our undergraduate speech pathology students particularly. But I certainly won't have the time to speak to the richness of the contribution that Teresa has made to teaching more broadly. I know that there will be many people here today who have benefited from Teresa's teaching, in addition to the speakers that we've already had. And up here in Bendigo, for example, I know that there are many people who have benefited from her work in her role as our Professor of Allied Health and during her time as our head of school, and her contribution to university policy, her engagement with our community, with our clinicians, with industry partners, and not to mention people with disability and their families as well. And her incredible, as everyone else has said, her incredible mastery of academic writing and her ability to help the rest of us understand it, which is we will all be forever changed in terms of being writers because of Teresa. So what I would like to focus on in the time that I have today is a thread that I believe runs through Teresa's approach to her teaching, and that is of prefacing the day-to-day lived experience of people with disability and their families. And I think this is really exemplified by the work that she did in terms of developing an online first-year subject. So I'm going to talk a little bit to that just as an example of Teresa's work. So this is a subject that has now been adopted as a core subject for many of our allied health disciplines, and has enrolments that I believe number in the many, many hundreds. And so there's a really wide reach in terms of the content of this subject. And the subject provides a foundation for considering different perspectives and diversity in disability. And for some of our disciplines, and particularly for some practice areas, the medical model is still quite dominant. But through this subject, the students get an early introduction to some different perspectives, different theories on disability, and particularly the social model, with that aim of, I guess, really challenging some of those assumptions and setting them up to think critically about their studies as they move through the remaining years of their course. So some of the learning activities that Teresa has contributed or worked on have included encouraging students to reflect on their own experience and what they take for granted, and also to engage with video scenarios, so some real world sort of authentic scenarios, experience of day-to-day experiences of people with disability, and these were developed by Teresa in collaboration with people with disability. And this approach, so prefacing the experience of people with disability, is one that Teresa also applied in her teaching across the other years of our course. And, for example, bringing in a parent to talk about her experience with our students, or a meeting with a student to help debrief after a clinical experience. So I think a measure of her success is in the messy space of clinical reasoning and decision-making, and the reflections and conversations that students have about placement and about clinical scenarios that are presented to them in class. And because I've had many of those conversations with students, I'm confident that we are now graduating students who are definitely more attuned to the voices and the experiences of people with disability, and who speak up when something doesn't feel comfortable, and are much better at being advocates, particularly around issues of choice and control. And I think a lot of that is the experience and the teaching that they've had from Teresa. So finally, I would like to reflect on some of the themes that have arisen from my PhD and my work with Teresa as a member of my supervisory team. And I think that I'll do this because I think that this continues the thread of learning and prefacing lived experience. So although my PhD is focused on experience in the context of acquired disability or stroke, I think many of the themes resonate with those working in the context of developmental disability. So I have learnt that communication as a tool for interacting and engaging with others shapes how we view ourselves, our confidence, our sense of agency, and our views around what is possible for us. And through this research, we've considered the role of health professionals and the way in which our interactions as health professionals shape the experience for the people that we work with. So, for example, what impact do we have when we listen to someone's story with the intention of knowing them better? Conversely, what impact do we have when we don't listen? You know, when time is short, when communication is slow and laboured and effortful, when we circumvent to save time. Our research participants have taught us that the impact is often one of loss of long-held views of competence, loss of agency, and at times loss of hope. So I guess, finally have absolutely cherished the hours that I've spent with my supervisors, of which Teresa is one, and sitting with the stories of the participants, imagining their experience and working to make sense of it. And I definitely have a very strong feeling that teaching health students to tune into lived experience, to listen to the voices and experiences of people with disability, improves the lives of people with disability, perhaps even more so than teaching students the application of specific technical skills. So yeah, thank you, Teresa. And I won't repeat all of the things that everyone else has said about your supervision, but just echo around the comments around the perfect supervisor. It's been, yeah, my PhD has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Kelly talked about the first year subject that Teresa developed and has now been going, I think, for 10 years at least, Teresa. And it was co-developed with Jane Tracy, who is a parent and, as many of you know, has been a GP that's been very active in this area and that was CEO of CDDHV. And she couldn't be with us today because she's busy being a grandparent, but she recorded a very short clip, which James is going to put on and play now.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person today. And I wanted to say that I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with Teresa for many years at the Centre for Developmental Disability Health and doing some fantastic projects with her. And I have so much appreciated her intellectual rigour, her energy, her vision, her grit to see things from their inception, their early ideas, right through to their conclusion and publication or implementation. She's just been inspiring person to work with and to know. And I have learnt so much from Teresa, both professionally, to learn about the ways in which people with intellectual disability can communicate and can learn, the different ways that people who use different forms of AAC communicate and learn. And that's informed my professional practice enormously and enriched my understanding of how people navigate their worlds and can influence their worlds. And it's also had a profound effect on my parenting. As many of you will know, I am the mum of a, well, not so young man anymore, but I've known Teresa for a lot of his developmental period. My son, Nick, doesn't use speech to communicate, but communicates through a range of AAC strategies. Very resourceful communicator. And Teresa has over the years helped me understand and support and help and really enlarge his communication repertoire because I understand his needs and his communications better because of her. So thank you, Teresa. Thank you for your professional contribution to my understanding and my knowledge and my work. And thank you for the personal contribution you've made to me and to my family through helping me understand communication and AAC better. So thank you. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to know you and to spend time with you and to work with you. And I look forward to staying friends on Facebook and sharing our adventures together, or whatever social platform comes up next anyway. All right, well, all the best, and I'm so pleased this seminar is being held in your honour, and you certainly deserve it. Thank you, Teresa.
Hey, thank you so much, Jane. And we've got 20 minutes left, Teresa, which is pretty good timing.
Thank you, Chris. People who know me will know this is surprising, but I am struggling to find words. This has been such an amazing, however many minutes we've been here. But anyway, I really wanted to focus my presentation on what I've come to see as kind of a dance of communication. And it's really 45 years. I actually sat down and did the sums. I went, oh, okay, it really wasn't 35. It's more like 45. Right, time to retire. Good-o. But it really was in terms of what have I learnt from people with intellectual disabilities along this journey. And those of you who may have seen my avatar that I've had when I've turned off my screen, I've put that together a long, long time ago, because it just spoke to me. It's like there's so much learning to be done. And when I sit and listen to people, it's with that sense of, oh, what does this mean? And how does that deepen or extend my understanding? And I think that's what people with intellectual disabilities has done for me. So I have a number of lessons that I want to share with you, but you'll be pleased to know it won't be every single lesson. And many of them did come from Pat, and I have passed them on to my students. And you can blame Pat for the anthropomorphisms, I believe. But anyway, one of the first things that I remember and it was when I was a student speech pathologist, and Kelly will laugh about this because we both know how little students retain from lectures. And this was the one thing I can remember from a lecture about mental retardation. And I'm sorry about the language, but you need to remember this was a long time ago, and that was the terminology. And basically the lecture, we had one lecture on mental retardation, and she said, basically, if the person does not have a gap between the comprehension and their production of speech, such that their comprehension was better, they really were not candidates for your services. That was my first introduction to this notion of candidacy for some type of service. And it didn't sit well with me, not because I knew people with intellectual disability, but it bothered me that people who perhaps were most in need of interventions that would support their communication were being locked out, and explained a lot of the lack of services that were being provided to people with disabilities. So my first year of practice, don't worry, the lesson is coming. In my first year of practice, I was in a little clinic room in Liverpool, Sydney, which is kind of the area I grew up in, seeing kids across a tabletop thinking, is this what I signed up for? And realizing that I really could not sustain a career if this were what it was going to be. And then I went to a conference, and it wasn't an Isaac conference. It was actually, I hadn't heard of Isaac. I don't even know if it was, I don't think it was a thing then. It was before 1985. And it was a speech path conference, and there was a woman who taught us about Makaton signs and the difference it had made for adults from an institution who were learning a symbolic form of communication, and they had not demonstrated any learning ability. And this was a lifeline to me. And I went up with a colleague in a bus from Sydney to Brisbane, because it was my first year. And on the way back, we were just madly learning all the signs in the Makaton manual, which was very small at that time. And I walked into a special school and offered my services. And of course, they were delighted because I wanted to get out of my clinic. And I remember preparing my pitch for why science could be good for their students who weren't speaking. And it was a bit like ramming a log into a very thin piece of plywood, because the principal just opened the door and said, yes, yes, you know, we really are fully into this. We are happy to learn. And so that was my way into augmentative and alternative communication. And so lesson one, and thank you, Pat, for providing the background, because it seems now that this is a given to those of us who are speech pathologists but beyond, that speech doesn't equal communication. But then that's what people thought, speech was communication. And what I learnt from that experience was I didn't know an awful lot really about communication. And yes, I just finished my undergraduate degree and wasn't that great, and I never want to study again. But guess what? Sign me up for a master's, because there is more to learn. In fact, so much that it was going to take me a long time. And so I, in steps, began my postgraduate study, and lesson number 2 really came from my work with Carl Parsons, who became my master's supervisor. And there were lots of lessons from Carl through attending speech camps with him and, you know, doing a bit of lecturing with him and observing him lecture and observing him in clinical practice. But the biggest lesson was that what someone doesn't do, or what you don't see happening, really doesn't tell you very much about what they can do. So just to unpack that lesson, what I learnt from Carl is to be a really good observer, not just a listener, but an observer, and someone who recorded what I saw in great detail. And one of my first jobs was with the then Deaf Blind Society, and I was employed 1 day a week for their assessments. And people would say to me, "Oh, you're not needed for this assessment because besides being blind, she doesn't speak." And then they were staggered because I would write copious amounts based on what I was seeing and the patterns of behaviours that were emerging. And I would go home and look for those patterns in my written notes. So mapping those behaviours within the social context that I was observing really provided powerful cues that told me about what then a child, because I was working with children, was really ready to learn. And maybe it wasn't even what they were about to learn. Maybe that they already had that learning but weren't able to demonstrate for us. And so assessment became more of a process of detective work. So really looking for those clues that told me about this individual than about administering a whole bunch of tests. And as Kelly and I see Sam is here will attest to, you know, we do a lot of teaching tests to our students, and I keep saying, you need to know how to do this, but you also need to know when to throw it away and when to just apply your good observation skills. Okay, lesson number 3. Just to let you know, there are only 8 lessons, so you'll be glad about that. I could just move on to the next one. Doesn't want to move. Great. So my next lesson, which came about when I was doing my master's work, was that the right scaffolds can not only move a person towards a target behaviour, but it could actually have quite powerful outcomes that maybe we weren't documenting. So in my master's, it's a very small N of 1 single case design study. It had a very modest aim to teach children with intellectual disability to produce 3 signs. These are kids who'd never demonstrated any conventional communication ability. And we just use the classic learning paradigm, a stimuli, some way to support them to provide a label or to make a request, and then a consequence where they receive the item. And it was food and drink, because that's what we were doing. And, you know, now we've kind of gone, okay, you can move on from the food and drink, but we were first arrived there then. I used a least to most prompts, which was I gave the person as much help as they needed, and sometimes they needed quite a lot of help. And I had 3 participants, all in special schools, and they were considered uneducable. Those of us who've been in the game for a long time will remember that term. They couldn't be taught. So I want you to picture a young man. He was about 13. We were in a small room that the school had made available for me to do my research. And that was no small gesture. And for this person, I'll call him Matt, his teacher was present. And I was teaching him the sign for biscuit. But so most of you will know this. So the sign for biscuit is you hold your hand like that and then you do a circle on your hand. That's the Australian sign, Pat. And I would give a partial, like, depending on his response, I would kind of give a partial response, partial model and see what he did. And lo and behold, I did this, and I just held his hand and then moved my hand away, and he completed the sign. Great. Ticked off my record sheet. And then I realized, I heard the teacher draw breath, and I looked at her and she said, I didn't think he could learn anything. So that small experience for her really changed how she thought about him and how she perhaps could provide more scaffolds rather than just having him present in her room. Oh, my mouse is wanting to play ball. Lesson number 4. Again, this will be given for many of us, but humans are innately driven to communicate through any means possible. So for this lesson, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to my PhD, completed in Nebraska under the supervision of Dave and Pat. And I had arrived in AAC Nirvana. I had fellow AAC students all doing projects under Dave and Pat, and they were, and still continue to be, and David's legacy lives on, as does Pat's, the leaders in the field. And I was in heaven. And the study I did as part of my PhD was even smaller than my master's, and that's another story. But anyway, there were 2 young children I worked with, and that was, as Pat had said, that was comparing use of sign versus sign plus an aided system to see if we could move their language learning along. They were both non-speaking, but they had large sign vocabularies. And this was really puzzling because the developmental or the typical development said, when you have a certain number of vocabulary, you should start combining those vocabulary into little, sentences, for want of a better word, or into word combinations. And I was like, well, why aren't you? Like, you've got the building blocks. What do we need to do to scaffold you to move to that next step? But that actually wasn't where the real learning came. It was through some of the other work that I did with these kids. And I'll tell you a story about working with one of these children. So my 2 kids were David. I want you to pick a young child. I can't remember how old he was, but he was in a primary school. He was cheeky, he was loud, he was rambunctious. I can't say the word now. So David, and the other was sweet, shy Michael. Didn't know his etiology. But David could keep you hostage in a room until you understood what he was trying to tell you. So one day I was trialing him with a high-tech system because, they were New Putin, and I was working with Dave and Pat at the University of Nebraska, and, we were finding out all these wonderful ways to use technology and finding the inadequacies of programming, as Sue mentioned, fringe vocabulary. So vocabulary that really focused on the content words around a play theme. But David knew how to bypass this or how to use the device in ways that I wouldn't have thought of. So we have this play scene, and I'm showing him the device and I'm modeling a bit for him and I'm letting him play around. And then he developed this imaginary story, and he found the symbol for rain, and it spoke out rain in a fairly flat kind of voice. rain. Think of that in a robotic voice. And he banged this button multiple times because I kept saying, oh, it's raining. And he looked at me and he just banged this button and looked at me, and he 3 or 4 times. And then he provided the sign, which in American sign was more. And I went, it's raining hard. And he looked at me and he kept signing and banging. And I said, it's storming. And he went, oh, thank God she's got it. And at that point, I was allowed out of the room. And he did this a number of times. He had a story to tell, and he would use any means possible to convey that story. And so that for me was it was really about how do we give them the means to express all the stuff they want to tell us. And that need to communicate as being innate. I was also reading, you'd be pleased to know that as PhD students, we did a lot of reading, a lot of theory, a lot of other research. And I was strongly influenced by the work of John Locke, who really talked about how children use speech or are really interested in speech as a way into the society to which they want to be part of, the human society. But the question came, well, what if speech is not accessible to a person, for whatever reason? And I didn't know why. And we didn't really understand that. But the need to communicate was still strong. So how do we best serve those? And it became clear that if we're responsive to those attempts and we're willing to stay with the person to co-construct meaning in the face of methods that even lack shared meaning. So if you don't have a conventional sign or symbol or a spoken word, how do we work together so that I can understand what you're trying to say and you can respond to my communication? And Kelly talked a little bit about the fact, well, very little, about the fact that in her research, she was working with people with acquired disabilities, and one of her participants, Craig, who had severe communication difficulties, Craig was very tenacious in making sure Kelly understood what he was trying to say, and he used every means possible: speech, the speech that he had, gesture, showing pictures of family, apps on his phone, taking the screen that they were using for their video session out into the yard, etc. And he reminded me so much of David. Okay, lesson number 5. Positive mutual regard promotes learning. Seems pretty obvious, but sometimes you need a concrete lesson. And you might be pleased to know I am jumping ahead a few years. At Macquarie University, in conducting research with my colleague and still close friend Linda Couples into reading for children with Down syndrome. Here was another example of a candidacy model that, these kids didn't demonstrate the phonological awareness needed to learn to read. And so we're just going to teach them using a whole word approach. Things have changed, and I'm not going to get into the reading wars. That would be another session, and I've moved away from that. But anyway, I learned a huge amount from Linda, who's a psycholinguist, and we designed beautiful studies. They were elegant. She was just a joy to work with. And this one study, we were working with children with Down syndrome again, and we were comparing a phonics approach versus a whole word approach, and we were using a computer-based intervention. But a child who really did teach me a lot was a 10-year-old boy who had absolutely no self-esteem. And that was because he'd had a lot of reading instruction and he had failed miserably. And he used to score 0 on our, wait for it, 60-word probe, which I would deliver every session, just once a week. And he would start his sessions with me, trying to read these words that he couldn't read, with his head down on the table. So like his nose was basically flat on the table. And I would have to encourage him to sit up and interact with me. And his mother couldn't help but showing her disappointment. I had to move her to behind him so he couldn't see her. Anyway, we scaffolded each lesson and we just didn't let him fail. We moved quickly through each task, and the word attack approach was starting to really register with him. And in the end, my last session with him, he scored 8 out of 60. Not a huge gain, right? But for Leonard, it meant a lot. And he was suddenly sitting up and interacting with me. And in fact, we developed such a strong bond that when we were in the intervention, it was very difficult for me sometimes to divert his gaze from me to the screen. It was lovely. I think about Leonard and my heart still melts, because he was so engaged with me and the interaction, and was willing to engage with the learning. Anyway, so he scored 8 out of 60, modest gain. There's that word again. But now he sits up and he beams at me. And then at his review, which was a few weeks later, he came in with his mum and a first grade reader, and he read the book from cover to cover. And he and his mum were so proud. Yes, we had a great intervention. We did all the, the proper scaffolding. But I really think that staying positive and moving him quickly really hit home for Leonard. So related to this lesson is that teaching others to respond promotes positive mutual regard. Now, Pat mentioned some work I did with Dr. Pam Mathieu-Laco in Wisconsin in the US, which was my year before my PhD studies. And we were working with support workers of people with severe, like really the most profound and multiple disabilities I'd ever experienced. And yes, they were in institutions. And what we were trying to do, and you'll see some threads that come through with the amazing work that Hilary and colleagues were doing. So what we were trying to do was to film and identify really subtle behaviours so that we could then sit down with the support workers and help them tune into those behaviours so that they could then respond to them. So this was my first real experience of increasing the responsivity of the communication partner, and make them help them to realise that there actually was this dance going on, and there was communication or potential for communication. And some of these behaviours were really quite subtle. And then that kind of fed into a study I did at Macquarie Uni a few years later with Jill, Irene, Carly and Kylie. And I thank Mark Carter for coming up, my colleague, for coming up with those very Aussie names at the time for this study. And each of those kids had severe and multiple disabilities and didn't use any form of symbolic communication. It was a fun study. I love fun studies. So I sat in a observation room, and we had all the materials for communication temptations. Some of you will know what that means, but I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time to go into it. But the teacher assistant was in the room with the child and had the materials. And rather than teach her what I wanted her to do, I just said, look, I'll just coach you. So she had a bug in the ear. So I would say, okay, I want you to present this, and I want you to wait 5 seconds, wait. Okay, now I want you to move it in. And so we were videotaping. So this allowed me to later record the child's behaviours and responses. So to give you an example of what happened, Irene, one of the young girls, was involved in a game in which she activated a switch that started the tape recorder that played her favourite music. At first, it was placed close enough to her for her to activate it, which actually took quite a bit of effort because of the severity of her disabilities. But we placed it somewhere that was easier for her. And then the teacher assistant slowly moved it away to the point where if she wanted it closer, she would have to do something. And these were children who did not demonstrate what we called signs of intentional communication, or when I say we called, what the literature was saying, this child has intentional communication versus this child is not showing any signs of intentional communication. So the teacher assistant moved away the tape, and till she finally couldn't reach it. And then Irene was a bit puzzled by this, and she would glance at the teacher assistant. And when I say glance, for someone with these types of disabilities, that actually involved quite a lot of coordination between her gaze and her motor movements. So this, think of this over, quite a number of seconds. But and she laughed, and this kind of grew a bit until the aide moved the tape recorder back and she was able to hit the switch. And one of the signs that, we actually had interpreted the behaviours correctly were that once she got to do what she wanted, she stopped with the laughing and the vocalisation, and she was happily hitting the switch. So the question was, were they trying to communicate? And we argued strongly that they were, because we carefully observed and recorded the behaviours which, when you combine them, were really strong indicators that, yes, they were trying to intentionally communicate with us, but they just didn't have that ability to coordinate these behaviours that kids who are following normal development, who don't have disabilities, can pretty readily do. And Pat will probably remember that study, because the first review I got back was pretty damning. It was really like, this is, for those of you who have been commenting on my good writing skills, I have to tell you, these reviewers did not. They didn't think much of the organisation and whatnot. But anyway, with Pat's and one of the reviewers' very amazing feedback, we were able to shape up this study, and it ended up winning a journal award. And Matt Scranland congratulated me at a conference, and that was so exciting. So anyway, so we learned a lot from that. And then look, that work, like while I was in the States, there were amazing things happening back home in Australia. And that was work that was driven by Hilary and the wonderful Karen Bloomberg and Denise West and Tina Caithness. And I mean, there are just so many of them. And some of them are here, and I'm really grateful of the chance to work with you. But I got the chance to then focus attention on the CCC, and I'm not going to talk too much more about that. But really, what struck me about the CCC was it really was about sensitising support workers to the behaviours that perhaps they weren't otherwise seeing. And I'm going to move through a bit quickly now, because we have run out of time, and I apologise. But this thread came through with the work that Sheridan and Hilary did, which really taught me a lot about that when you are responsive and observant, you learn a lot about what the person's behaviour says about their humanity and personhood, which really threw those ideas on the head, because before that, it was really about what they were able to tell you, their proficiency in communication. And it also fed into Stella's work around challenging behaviours, because what we learnt was that if you ignore those behaviours, then you can get challenging or difficult behaviours as people try to escalate what they're doing to get a response from others. And the flip side of that is they may actually stop trying to send out signals. So they may develop some learned helplessness. Another bleeding obvious lesson was that affording choice requires respecting what's been chosen. Knew that. That was a fairly basic thing in AAC. But we really were thinking of it in terms, if I give you a preferred item and a non-preferred item, or something that's good for you versus bad for you, and you choose something that's good for you, you should get that because you communicated it, and I have to respect your choice. That notion expanded dramatically through my work with David Tremba, an autism researcher who's been mentioned a couple of times. But I gained a much deeper understanding through really talking to him and learning more about neurodiversity affirming supports. And if I apply this principle more broadly, it's about respecting and appreciating that not everyone can or even wants to use sign or aided systems or other forms of conventional communication. And that I have to actually respect that if that's their choice. And I may need to engage in conversations that require an awful lot of work on both sides, but that work actually keeps us engaged with each other and in that dance of communication. Nearly there, sorry. Lesson 8 is blank because it took me a little while to formulate this, but recently, well, in my final work with LIDS and with colleagues from LIDS, some of whom are here, and thank you, I see you. But I got the chance to work with these amazing people, and working with Jacinta Douglas, who was also part of the executive of LIDS, and with Chris, I really was learning more about my role as a clinician, a researcher, and educator in disability, and what that role was. And I will get to it. So I want to introduce 3 people who were the stars in our project around developing resources for supporting people with intellectual disability in hospital. And we've talked about that at previous presentations, and you can find information about it. But this was our launch, which really showcased our 3 key actors in what we hope were authentic videos, because they were based on research that Chris led around hospital experience. And we looked for positive things that contributed to good outcomes and good experiences. So this is Jared, who is speaking at the launch. Jared's an advocate as well as an actor. He loves a good chat, so he speaks. Sometimes it's difficult to end the conversation with Jared, and he can be really difficult to follow. So you've got to really stay with it and work with him. And on the night of the launch, he talked about his work on the project and how he hoped the website would be useful. He was difficult to understand, but his message was really clear and concise. This is Callie. She wasn't new to acting, and she's featured in other video projects, including those related to the NDIS. She uses AAC with messages prepared by her mum, Deb, who supports and scaffolds communication very much in the way that Jane has done for years. And Callie was the darling on the production sets. She was all about the individual interactions with the people who quite easily and readily engaged with Callie. You couldn't help but fall in love with that. Her presentation was pre-recorded so that her mum could help scaffold it. But she proudly faced the audience and hit the switch that launched the website. And lastly was Robert. He doesn't use speech or any form of conventional communication, but he managed to do what he needed to do in each of the scenes that he featured. And he knows how to hold the attention of the audience. He entertained us as he worked the microphone and the room, and we were all spellbound. Robert is about the moment, and if you're lucky, he'll invite you in to share it. And you just need to accept that invitation. And if you weren't at the launch, I'm really sorry, you missed a great evening. But those of you who were there will know what I mean. So where was I with my last lesson? My role is to recognise, appreciate, value, and celebrate each person, including the modes they choose for communication, and to provide support where I can. And I want to thank Pat Mirenda and Sue London and Hilary Johnson and all my students, especially those who were asked to speak today, which was no small thing. So I really appreciate it. I want to pay tribute to Karen Bloomberg and Dave Buchelman, who are no longer with us, because my God, they taught me a lot. And especially I want to thank Chris and all of you who've really listened to me talk and raised questions and made me think and reflect deeply about what my work in understanding the complexity of communication in the absence of speech really means. Thank you all. And apologies I'm late.
Thank you, Teresa, so much. There's so many people that I want to say how much fun it's been to work with you, what your contribution has been. thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you to our speakers for thinking about both talking about communication and Teresa's contribution to it. And the recording will be on our website. The slides will be on our website. If you don't know what our website is, it's lids at La Trobe. Email us and we'll send you the links. And Teresa, we're going to miss you so much, but I'm sure we're going to find you interesting things to do. And I promise I won't send you any more tenders or requests to do literature reviews. We'll just find interesting things for you to do. But from my perspective, it's like this idea of you being a selfless supervisor, you're a selfless colleague. I always know when I need to talk to somebody, I can talk to you and you will listen and you will have some really sage advice for me. And for me, that's been such a good way of working with you over these last few years. So thank you so much for your contribution to LIDS and to everybody in LIDS. I think we've all valued your input and we're not going to let you go that easily. So thank you so much, and we will be in touch. And thanks everybody for coming. And Bronwyn says, that was fantastic. Good luck, Teresa. We will see you again soon.